Even if you've never seen Mommie Dearest before, you probably still know a couple of its most famous lines. Like, do I even need to say it?
Known you know where to find the boys and the booze.
Don't fuck with me, fellas!
Tina!
Bring me the axe! I'd rather you go bald to school than looking like a tramp! Nothing is good!
The film has become notorious, not only for its second life as a cult classic, but also for its tumultuous production history and effect it had on its star, Faye Dunaway.
Do you like all the parts that you have playing in your career?
Do I like all of them? No. No. I mean, the most difficult part, and I always feel the one that was the biggest mistake in a certain way, was Crawford.
So today I'm going to try and unpack all of it. Well, most of it. My intention with this video is not to fact-check the story or to evaluate Christina Crawford's experience with trauma. I aim to understand how the film gained the reputation it has today and to analyze its effects on the legacies of Joan Crawford and Faye Dunaway as public figures. In my research, I prioritized its production history, the goals of the filmmakers in bringing it to life, and how the press has talked about these women as a result of the film. While I don't think any essay about Mommie Dearest can be 100% objective, I've done my best to outline the details as I understand them without conjecture. Dunaway likes to say,
you know, only God will ever know what passed between them.
Only God will ever know what happened between those two people.
Nobody but God will ever know what happened between those two people. Nobody but God will ever know what went on between that girl and that mother.
And given the scope of what I can reasonably prove as a humble YouTuber, that's essentially where I'm going to leave it. Before we get started, I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, NordVPN. In my last video, I talked about one of my favorite movies, A Foreign Affair. I was living in Berlin the first time I saw it, and knowing that I was walking the same streets that I saw in the film totally changed how I experienced it. Where you live can make a huge difference on not only how you see a film, but also what you see. What we see is usually limited by what streaming services put in their libraries, and that's based on where you live. NordVPN can help you get around that. All you have to do is connect to one of their thousands of servers all around the world, and then you see the internet as if you were physically located somewhere else. Once I connect to Germany, for example, I can access different films and see tons of recommendations for what to watch next, leading me to a brand new rabbit hole that I can fall down. They have thousands of super fast servers in nearly 60 countries, unlimited bandwidth, and have partnered with cybersecurity firms to keep your data safe. It takes no time at all to set up before you can access a truly global internet and view information you might not see otherwise, all securely done from your phone or computer. You can connect up to 6 devices simultaneously on just one NordVPN account. And right now, because they're sponsoring this video, you can get a 2-year plan at a huge discount at nordvpn.com/BeKindRewind and use the code BeKindRewind to get 1 additional month free. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Use the link in the description below to get in on this deal before it ends.
Tony guided to take us to 7 o'clock. Tony? Thank you, Chuck. Good evening to you. Joan Crawford, who rose from a chorus girl to one of the top stars of the golden age of movies, died today of a heart attack at her Manhattan home. She was born Lucille LeSueur, and she went to Hollywood from Broadway musicals. Her first movie was Pretty Ladies in 1926. Zazu Pitts was the star. She left the world of glamour and dancing in 1945 when she showed her dramatic abilities in the movie Mildred Pierce. She's been inactive in recent years. She had no history of serious ailments before her death of a heart attack this morning. Joan Crawford was 69 years old.
According to biographer Charlotte Chandler, Joan Crawford had about $2 million to her name at the time of her death, most of which went to charities. To her 4 adopted children, she left the twins, Kathy and Cindy, about $77,000 each. To Christina and Christopher, she wrote, "It is my intention to make no provision herein for my son Christopher or my daughter Christina for reasons which are well known to them." When this mysterious message from beyond the grave appeared in newspapers, it immediately raised a red flag. Perhaps not all was well in the Crawford family. Perhaps a seismic shift in the Joan Crawford discourse was about to occur. About a year and a half later, in November 1978, Christina Crawford published a memoir called Mommie, Dearest, which accused her mother of physical and mental abuse and chronicled her erratic and sometimes violent behavior. Night raids to deep clean the house, forcing Christina to eat rare meat, severe spankings, an aversion to wire hangers, which I don't know, maybe you've heard about, and more. In one fell swoop, the book shattered the illusion of Joan Crawford, the movie star, who Americans had come to love. On the heels of that ominous line in Joan's will, the book appeared to be part of a distinct arc. Mommie, Dearest wasn't just a tell-all. It was revenge, matricide, poetic justice. Christina was getting the last laugh.
As usual, she has the last word.
Does she?
As with any charge of this magnitude, Christina's allegations caused a fair degree of controversy. Joan's fans, friends, and even enemies leapt to her defense, denying that the Joan Christina had written about was not the one that they knew. Kathy, one of the twins, called it the product of a sick mind. Reviews of the book were not kind either. Many critics believed it read like a laundry list of offenses and lamented that it did little to enlighten audiences as to who Joan Crawford actually was. They frequently compared it to a then recently published biography of Joan by veteran film critic Bob Thomas, who also reached a harsh verdict on her parenting, but more actively sought to contextualize her actions in the scheme of her own difficult life. One critic wrote, "Thomas says more in a few sentences than Christina Crawford seems to perceive in her entire book," when he quotes one of Joan's friends. "I'm sure that Joan loved those children, but something, probably out of her own childhood, drove her to discipline them unreasonably. Very often, the battered child grows up to be an abusive parent." This, of course, does not deny or diminish what Christina experienced. To know why the hammer is swung does not remove the pain of its impact. Still, one would think that anyone who could muster whatever it takes to write a book about a given subject could take the next step and arrive at an understanding of that subject. At the same time, none of this really mattered. The last laugh arc to Christina's story was too enticing, her truth too scandalous, and on some perverse level, too entertaining to ignore. The book became a veritable phenomenon, shot to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, and stayed on that list for 42 weeks. Mommie, Dearest was so successful that it is credited with the proliferation of parent-based exploitation memoirs in years to come. Although it technically wasn't the first, Haywire by Brooke Hayward came out the year prior and similarly detailed her difficult child as the daughter of Leland Hayward and Margaret Sullivan. Still, with such a success, it was only natural for Hollywood to come calling. Enter Frank Yablans. As president of Paramount from 1971 to 1975, Frank Yablans helped usher films like The Godfather, Parts 1 and 2, Chinatown, Love Story, and Serpico to the screen. In the final year of his presidency alone, Paramount's films earned 39 Oscar nominations. After some internal reshuffling at the studio, he became an independent producer in 1975 and turned his attention toward finding his next great hit. Then he heard about Mommie, Dearest and quickly plunked down $500,000 for the screen rights before the memoir was even released. Christina chose to tell the painful truth about her relationship with her mother, and instead of being applauded for her courage, she's being condemned, he said in an interview. "The main reason I want to make Mommie, Dearest is because of the issue of child abuse, an issue which has been kept undercover for too many years." And so in 1978, Mommie, Dearest, the movie, began development. Yablans immediately entered into talks with Italian director Franco Zeffirelli to helm the film. Had Mommie, Dearest come to life under his leadership, it probably would have been a very different movie, particularly since he already had experience directing Faye Dunaway in The Champ. In interviews, Zeffirelli emphasized his desire to foreground the psychological, to show how difficult the film industry could be for women by building out Joan's side of the story. He said, "To survive, a woman must become tough, often become a monster. I've seen it happen to 2 women to whom I served as friend, confidant, business associate." He's talking about Anna Magnani and Maria Callas here, which to me suggests maybe a tendency to conflate women rather than treat them as individuals with unique histories, but his inclinations for this project prove far more comprehensive than the film would ultimately become. To portray Joan, Yablans began talking to Anne Bancroft, who shared Zeffirelli's point of view. Bancroft stalled on committing to the project and continually appealed for changes to the script that would paint a more sympathetic or nuanced portrait of the star. Broadly speaking, the screenplay was a significant hurdle for Yablans. Truly, the number of writers attached to it at one point or another is astonishing, although perhaps, in retrospect, not surprising. Initially, Christina was hired as the screenwriter, but Yablans was unhappy with her work and replaced her with writer Robert Getchell. Then James Kirkwood, co-author of a chorus line, tried his hand to no avail, and in November 1979, William Goldman wrote a draft. Eventually, in April 1980, Tracy Hotchner had a go. Thanks to the concluding chapter of Crawford, which really is an excellent resource, her draft is available online. And though I can't be sure who read what version and when, it does seem to reflect Zeffirelli and Bancroft's desire to delve deeper into Joan's professional life. It begins with Joan in L.B. Mayer's office at MGM. In the film's first minutes, he fondles her breast without her consent, before bestowing the name Joan Crawford upon her without her input. As Bancroft dragged out the process, Zeffirelli left to pursue another project. Yablans then turned to indie director Frank Perry, wow, a lot of Franks, who had found success in films like David and Lisa and Diary of a Mad Housewife, both of which were scripted by his then ex-wife, Eleanor Perry. Perry approached the film with a much more literal translation of the book in mind. My job was to turn the whole thing into a movie that was not only faithful to the book we bought, but also an entertainment, he said. I read the book with fascination the minute it came out. My instinct was, this is a hurt, injured, and very seriously damaged girl who had real scars. I also believed that the book was absolutely true. Suspecting Bancroft was leaning toward a no, she was, and eventually chose to do The Elephant Man instead. Yablans and Perry began considering alternatives for Joan, which at one point apparently included Sigourney Weaver. Then they began quietly talking to Faye Dunaway about taking over the role.
Many years ago, Joan Crawford told a reporter that of all the young actresses on the way up, only one had the makings of a true star, and that was Faye Dunaway.
After her Oscar win for Network, Faye Dunaway starred in a series of roles that did well at the box office, but for the most part didn't receive great reviews, including the perpetually underrated mystery thriller Eyes of Laura Mars and The Disappearance of Amy alongside Bette Davis, which I guess didn't go very well.
So who's one of the worst people you know in Hollywood?
That I worked with?
Or that you wouldn't want to work with again? If you don't have to comment on that.
$1 million, Faye Dunaway.
Audiences weren't done with her, but she was due for a prestige vehicle, something big to bring home Oscar #2, and playing one of the world's biggest movie stars in an adaptation of an extremely popular book obviously seemed like a good opportunity. Although some warned her against taking a role that might inspire Hollywood to defend its own, she decided to pursue it. Michael Musto wrote for The Village Voice, once Faye decided she wanted the role, she dressed uncannily like Joan and went to the house of producer Frank Yablans, aiming to impress him. When Yablans saw what looked like back from the dead Joan standing before his eyes, he almost had a heart attack and plotzed. Even if Faye Dunaway wasn't the first choice to play Joan Crawford, she definitely was a good one. They didn't exactly play similar roles/types, although they could certainly intersect at points. I could easily see Joan thriving in the thwarted Cinderella story of Bonnie Parker, and Dunaway as a tragic, elegant professional and humoresque, for example. But for the most part, Joan Crawford had a shifting persona, marked by changes in time and fashion.
I was a flapper in the age of flappers. I became a sophisticated lady in the age of sophistication.
While Dunaway became known for dangerous, glamorous women, more akin to Marlene Dietrich or Greta Garbo. I thoroughly outlined both of their personas in my videos about their Oscar wins, which I'll link below if you're curious. Still, even if they weren't interchangeable on screen as actors, the parallels between them in real life made Faye Dunaway feel like a natural choice. She admitted to a fierce ambition common to both stars. Both were poor and from broken homes. Each developed early self-sufficiency.
Do you feel in any way a kinship to Joan Crawford? Is she anything like you are?
I feel an enormous kinship. Enormous. You have to admire a woman with that sort of determination and that sort of desire. Then what you look at is what happened to her as a result of it. And, how then did her life go on, and to what degree was she victimized by her own passions, by her own what is a wonderful quality of hunger and a desire that everything should be wonderful and perfect. When then did it turn if it is not perfect, it won't do?
Faye Dunaway's identification with Joan's ambition and intensity seems so complete that this clip almost reads like Faye talking unwittingly about herself. The drive they shared gives them a similar energy, a kind of ferociousness they contain in a single self-assured stare that, in theory, would help Faye translate Joan onto the screen as a character. Like Bancroft, Dunaway sought to portray a more sympathetic rendering of Joan than the one in the book. "The scandal books about Crawford make me furious," she told the New York Times. "That was one of the main reasons I wanted to do this movie. They are by far not the real story. She achieved, and while monsters do achieve great deeds, she wasn't one. Crawford was a warrior." So with the understanding that the film would investigate who Joan was, she got on board. At this point, the script was still not finished. There would eventually be 18 different revised shooting scripts. But after she signed on, Yablans and Perry went to Palm Springs to work on the script, which was written in 12 days. Shooting began in early 1981. In May 1981, Roger Ebert visited the set of Mommie, Dearest. "This is the sort of irony that Hollywood understands," he wrote. "Joan Crawford spent her entire life in the painstaking construction of an image, only to have a movie reveal the things she tried to hide behind the image. The movie is being made on closed sets on the back lot at Paramount. In Hollywood, a closed set usually signifies a movie with a controversial subject or a temperamental star. This movie has both." Faye Dunaway did indeed have a reputation for being difficult on set, and this experience was apparently no different. She was incurably tardy to the point that Paramount executives considered firing her. This scene got so physical that Diana Scarwood's safety became a genuine concern. And as Rutanya Alda details in her book, The Mommie Dearest Diary, Carol Ann Tells All, she clashed with costume director Irene Sheriff to the point that Sheriff left the set in tears. Aside from all these behavioral issues, many of the film's problems essentially boiled down to jockeying for power over its direction. Here's how Frank Perry described the behind-the-scenes dynamic in an interview. "We had two big problems that plagued us throughout. They came in the form of two executive producers. One was Dave Kuntz, who's Christina Crawford's husband. The other was Terry O'Neill, who is Faye Dunaway's lover. They got married later. David wanted Joan meaner, more vicious, capable of beating the hell out of the children and turning into a monster every scene. Terry kept protesting, saying, 'No, she can't touch the children or Faye won't play the scene.' I handled it as tactfully as I could, which was to say, 'Gentlemen, get the hell out of my way. I've got a movie to make, and I've got to make it the way I see it.'" He says that, but in reality, it doesn't sound like Perry handled it very well at all, and rumors continue to leak about temper tantrums and delays on set. By her own account, Faye Dunaway had a very difficult time playing Joan Crawford, both mentally and physically. She wrote in her memoir, "I'll go all the way with something because that's how I work." And as a method actress, that unwavering commitment to her craft could obviously be beneficial, but it could also push her too far. Playing a character who spewed so much vitriol in a relentlessly packed screenplay, she gradually seemed to lose control.
But it had an enormous amount of extremity to it, and where that is, there are always passions and enormous feelings that are not manageable because they go out of control. So all those things had to be gone absolutely to the heart of in order to make any sense out of what happened between the mother and the daughter and what happened to the mother, from my point of view, on her own. It took me 2 months, and I sort of timed it to really start to feel like myself again.
The wire hanger scene is a perfect example. It's iconic, of course, for its extremity, but the degree to which she pushed herself during that scene was also detrimental to her health. She collapsed in exhaustion and destroyed her vocal cords, requiring attention from a specialist before she could continue filming. Despite what sounds like pure chaos on the set, Dunaway, Yablans, and Perry were convinced that they had an awards contender on their hands. To them, Mommie Dearest would cause Americans to sincerely confront the horrifying truths of child abuse. And yet, toward the end of Ebert's tour on set, Frank Yablans summarized his view on the film's direction this way. My thinking on this picture is that we're selling glamour, fantasy, and tragedy. And if those are the three words you use to describe your 100% serious film about child abuse, you might have a problem on your hands. In anticipation of the film's release, Paramount encouraged Crawford movie series in revival houses and Crawford festivals on television stations, and ramped up an extensive marketing campaign to emphasize the tempestuous mother-daughter relationship and the glamour of classic Hollywood. To you blondes, the poster said it all. I decided early on to sell Faye as Joan, because Joan was an elegant woman, a star, a legend, and the illusion of perfection, he told the New York Times. Whether the picture survives or fails depends on how the public perceives Faye's performance. Well, he wasn't wrong.
For one of the most entertaining movies of the year, let's move on to one of the least entertaining and most painful movies of the year. The film is Mommie, Dearest, starring Faye Dunaway in an unremittingly unpleasant portrait of movie star Joan Crawford.
Mommie, Dearest was released in September 1981, and critics were not enthusiastic. Once again, the majority contended that the story did nothing to contextualize Joan and simply placed a series of unrelenting, exaggerated incidents back to back.
What made Joan Crawford run? This movie never says. There's no explanation for the star's cruelty toward her child, not even the kind of bargain basement Freudianism that Hollywood usually throws in for free.
Janet Maslin of the New York Times wrote, "She needn't have been lionized here, but she did need more humanity than Mr. Perry allows her in order for Mommie Dearest to have any claim to coherence or continuity." Even Christina hated it and had attempted to buy back the rights when she had read other versions of the script.
I was devastated by the movie. Because it was clear to me when I only saw it once that it was so over the edge. It was a melodrama. They had made it
worse than she was?
No, and it didn't even make her more bizarre than she was. What it did is it switched the whole story from being the story of the child suffering the abuse and trying to live through it and survive to a woman of Hollywood who just wasn't obeyed.
Then the film's reception took an entirely unexpected turn. Although the filmmakers intended to induce tears or gasps at the film's ostensibly harrowing depiction of child abuse, Mommie Dearest was playing, apparently, to raucous laughter across the country. Nobody was taking their very serious movie seriously.
Kids come apparently and bring hangers and cleanser and talk to the screen. And
it's going to get to be a cult film.
Well, that would be wonderful, I think.
However, it turned out that cackling over stuff like,
"Barbara, please! Please, Barbara!"
was exactly what audiences wanted. The film grossed over $750,000 at its September 1981 New York City premiere, which according to Paramount marked the biggest September opening in the history of New York. After the studio realized what it had, it capitalized on the phenomenon and changed its advertising campaign to feature wire hangers instead of a portrait of Dunaway, with the text, "The biggest mother of them all." You blondes found this very offensive and immediately sued Paramount for $10 million, which was eventually refused in court. Mommie Dearest has since taken on a life of its own that has nothing to do with the filmmaker's intentions, nor with the reviews it received upon release. There's something else about it that attracts viewers to it. Whether or not it's quote-unquote good is sort of irrelevant, so I don't think it's necessarily useful to judge the film or Faye Dunaway's performance by the standards of the traditional critical paradigm. Instead, I think it's more valuable to simply understand it for what it is. The Citizen fucking Kane of camp. To unravel what that means exactly, I'm going to use Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp as a guide. Though not the be-all, end-all of the camp discourse, it helps put to words why Mommie Dearest fascinates audiences. What camp taste responds to is instant character, and conversely, what it is not stirred by is the sense of development of character. Character is understood as a state of continual incandescence, a person being one very intense thing. Camp is art that proposes itself seriously, but cannot be taken altogether seriously because it is too much. Camp is a sensibility that, among other things, converts the serious into the frivolous. Camp is a version of the world in terms of style, but a particular kind of style. It is the love of the exaggerated, the off, of things being what they are not. Camp sees everything in quotation marks. It's not a lamp, but a lamp. Not a woman, but a woman. To perceive camp in objects and persons is to understand being as playing a role. As Yablans predicted, Faye Dunaway's performance really is key to this whole thing. John Waters once called it the first drag queen role played by a woman. The sheer excess of it is difficult to take seriously. At the same time, it's absolutely captivating to watch. You cannot and don't want to look away. By amplifying every single emotion and gesture, she didn't really give us an idea of who Joan Crawford was.
Is that anywhere near the way Joan Crawford actually acted?
Only the makeup.
But she did invent a hyperbolic, stylized version of Joan. In other words, Joan. Some critics were receptive to this kind of performance. Much like those who brought hangers to their local theaters, Pauline Kael's review in The New Yorker praised Dunaway's exaggeration, calling her performance extravagant, operatic, hard-nosed Crawford drag. She referenced the aesthetic of Joan's rejection of the wire hangers, and said it recalled the gothic flamboyance of whatever happened to Baby Jane. She wasn't alone. A lot of critics felt the same way. That year, Dunaway was the runner-up for New York Critics Circle Best Actress Award. Still, other critics were repelled by it. The division was such that this same year, she also won the Razzie for Worst Actress, one of the film's 8 Razzies that year. Dunaway has been pretty open about her feelings on this role, which seem largely negative and not without contradictions. When she talks about Mommie Dearest, she is judging it through the traditional critical paradigm. Camp, to her, is derogatory, so she actively creates distance between herself and the performance.
I'm sorry to say, it became camp. It wasn't brought into a vision that said, look, let's really talk about who these two people were.
I felt the emphasis from the producers and the director in the end was more towards camp than towards really, in human terms, what happened between the two people.
Almost caricature towards the end.
Exactly.
She wrote in her memoir, "It was camp that had gone way over the edge. Everything about this production was out of kilter, off-center, and somehow I could never find my way back to some sort of middle ground. I now recognize the performance for what it is, a good performance. A performance that, unfortunately, did not have the modulation of a good director. But my job is to go in there and act it to a fare thee well, which I did. At the same time, I also know that the overall tone of a movie is never really in the hands of the actors. That rests with the director and the producers. On that movie, with the exception of Terry, I had no allies." Honestly, I think she's pretty right on here. If the intention was to make a serious film about stardom and child abuse, which as we've learned from Dunaway, Yablans, and Perry's quotes, it was, then directorial intervention could have helped tone down many of the film's campiest moments. Even Joan knew that.
Well, Wolf, I don't think anyone starts out thinking they're going to make a bad picture. They're hoping that the director they choose, the producer, the writers, and everyone who works on the set with them will offer a bit of advice and help to overcome the weaknesses. And there are weaknesses in every script, in every story. Like your child. A child has weaknesses.
At the same time, she has never, and probably will never, take responsibility for helping take it over the edge in the first place. In some sense, it's kind of a shame that Faye Dunaway openly regrets this role, because even if it wasn't the performance she intended to give, it really is beloved by so many people. And I could easily imagine a world where she has a sense of humor about it and collects nice fat checks to yell "no wire hangers" at a theater full of gays for anniversary screenings. For what it's worth, Christina has since acknowledged the film's status as a camp classic and told Salon, "I've certainly heard the jokes and seen the cards. This is a way of saying that I understand. Far better that my sense of humor should also be engaged." The closest thing to a joke about it I can find from Dunaway is this blink and you miss it Carol Ann reference in the Gucci ad she did with Soko. Still, I understand why the memory of it could sting. Remember, Dunaway deeply empathized with Joan and explicitly stated that she signed on to the film because she wanted to humanize her. Dunaway was also an avowed student of method acting who, by training, craved truth in every performance. It must have been very jarring, maybe even embarrassing, to realize that her performance not only contributed to the demonization of Joan Crawford, more on that later, and that her acting specifically was being parodied for its outrageousness by audiences across the country. It was kind of like a murder-suicide, and really, who wants to talk about that?
Oh, I think the result of the movie was, well, I think a lot about that movie because I've talked about, thought about it a lot. It was really...
The film also had very real consequences for the course of her career. When Faye Dunaway's glamorous, dangerous woman persona was taken to its extreme, it lost its allure and seriousness, threatening the viability of the persona she had carefully crafted for years. As she puts it, "I never compromised the acting in playing Joan, but I think the film ultimately did compromise my career." In 1994, Diane Haithman wrote in the LA Times that Faye Dunaway was unofficially relieved of her movie stardom crown in the 1980s. David Denby at The New Yorker was much more blunt. Mommie Dearest finished her career as a star. The shift away from that stardom was severe. She moved to the UK, where she basically laid low for about 8 years and took much smaller, low-profile roles. Of course, the reaction to Mommie Dearest was a major factor in this, but more broadly speaking, she had just turned 40, which, as we know, is a curse for women in Hollywood, was famously difficult on set, and happened to give the quote-unquote worst performance of her life, just as Meryl Streep, Glenn Close, and Jessica Lange were emerging as serious players in the industry. Opportunities would become more scarce in an industry that considers women highly replaceable.
But did you ever pass on a role that you regret to this day? Why didn't I do that?
Even then went on to be made by someone else?
Yeah.
A few along the line. The one I guess that people would know most is Frances Farmer, which Jessica Lange played. Yeah. And very well. But I didn't want to play another crazy movie star.
You just done Mommie Dearest? Is that right after? Oh, yes.
I'm still trying to live down.
Her return to Hollywood is marked by noticeable variations in her filmography. She began to buy and produce her own work, including Cold Sassy Tree and Masterclass, which she still owns the film rights to. She consciously deglammed in Barfly and Don Juan DeMarco, and made several attempts at comedy, including a short-lived sitcom, which is on YouTube and is exactly what you think it is.
Albert, if I had $1 for each time you threatened to kill yourself when you were late finishing a book, I could buy enough coffee to wake up Truman Capote and have him write it.
In interviews, she coupled her desire to try new material with the concern that playing Joan had convinced people that she was really like that in real life. In a post-Mommie Dearest world, she de-emphasized the same similarities she used to stress.
Faye Dunaway's remarkable performance in the current movie Mommie Dearest has people wondering how much like Joan Crawford Faye Dunaway is.
Because she so rarely gives interviews, the public, she fears, believes Faye Dunaway is like the icy, remote, manipulative, and even dangerous woman she has so often played on the screen.
I might take Crawford back, but I really wouldn't, because I did like her so much. And I did, it was the only reason is because she was very larger than life, and I don't want to be that myself. And there's an inevitable tendency of people who both work in the industry and the audience to associate, to think you're like the parts you play. There wasn't a lot of chance in the film for the softness or for the light side of me, the intelligent side of me, the gentle side of me, the generous side of me.
But I liked her the least because I felt uncomfortable being identified with her. I felt uncomfortable with her as a part of my persona, which of course she became, to some degree.
This is true. Joan Crawford was folded into her persona, but it's also true that she was folded into Joan's. Let's take Alyssa Edwards' performance on Snatch Game as an example of how the two have collapsed into each other. The aesthetic is pure Joan, exaggerated lips and eyes with glossy architectural hair. But the lines she speaks aren't from Mildred Pierce, or even Baby Jane. They're from Mommie Dearest.
Christina, bring me the axe.
It's kind of like a drag performance of Faye Dunaway doing a drag performance of Joan Crawford. But as much as Dunaway worried about Joan becoming a part of her persona, it's not her name on the placard, it's Joan Crawford's. For her, Mommie Dearest wasn't a role, it was her actual life on display. Joan's reputation was by no means spotless prior to Mommie Dearest. She'd been known to have her feuds, there had been the divorces, her comically undying devotion to Pepsi, her deliriously sanitized books. Her most recent film output consisted primarily of subpar exploitation, which were mocked as desperate and degrading attempts at relevance. But to understand how the film redefined Joan Crawford's legacy, let's take a look at the words used to describe her in the aftermath of the film's release. Her persona was flattened into a series of often ableist and misogynist labels: a dictatorial harpy, ugly old witch, monster, hysterical monster, authentic monster, schizophrenic, Crawford the Terrible. Now, when people think about bad Hollywood parents, they think about Joan Crawford because, in a way, they've seen it. The impact of equally devastating allegations against other classic Hollywood stars have sort of dampened over time. Maybe Bing Crosby will get a joke on Family Guy.
And if your kids give you any lip, you can beat them with a sack of sweet Valencia oranges. They won't leave a bruise, and they'll let them know who's boss.
But Christina's abuse is uniquely immortalized in quotable clips that we still weave into everyday life.
Jesus Christ.
We don't know what Joan could or would have said in response to Christina, because she couldn't fight back. In her absence, the narrative was formed for her. To me, labels like monster don't do very much to understand anything about abuse or how it perpetuates. On this channel, I've talked a lot about how cunningly Joan Crawford navigated her career and how she managed to outlast most of her peers with what Molly Haskell called her extraordinary will to survive. But the battles she waged to escape the abject poverty of her childhood and to achieve what she did professionally came with sacrifices and consequences. In competent hands, her story could be a heartbreaking Faustian drama that would expose a terribly flawed and scarred, but resilient and intuitive human being. Mommie Dearest isn't that. But I'd wager it's what the average person knows about Joan Crawford today, if they know anything at all. Still, I think no understanding of the cultural influence of this film could be complete without taking a look at the communities who have embraced it the most. In 1973, Joan Crawford showed up for an evening at Town Hall in New York City called Legendary Ladies of the Screen. Her night, like Myrna Loy, Bette Davis, and Sylvia Sidney's before her, began with a comprehensive look at her career and ended with a question and answer session. In an article written about the event, she said that she noticed her town hall audience was preponderantly homosexual. Though she couldn't explain the phenomenon, she said, "I don't know, but I like them. I've always been very friendly with them." The article goes on to do some 1970s psychoanalysis of gay audiences, but the point persists. Gay audiences love and continue to love Joan Crawford, and the release of Mommie Dearest was a seminal event in both cementing and complicating that love. Its campy slogans and over-the-top emotions came ready-made for drag shows. Daniel Harris writes, New York City drag queens commemorated the 1981 release of Mommie Dearest by dressing up as Joan Crawford and kicking life-size effigies of her daughter Christina up and down Christopher Street. In 1998, Paul Festa wrote about the film's continuing appeal for Salon. The movie inspires a different moral universe than does the book, and a theater full of gay men watching Mommie Dearest is like an arena full of boxing fans on nitrous oxide, egging on the antagonist through hysterical laughter. When Joan lands a punch, we cheer. It's an extremely complicated topic, and rather than generalizing about the complexities of what Mommie Dearest and Joan Crawford mean to gay and drag communities, I decided to speak to someone who would know a lot more than me about their thoughts on the topic.
Hello. Oh, it's always a pleasure for me to visit with you each. Oh. Oh, I'm sorry.
My name is John Epperson, and I am a performer. I am a musician. I'm a writer. And I guess I'm a surrealist. That's what I call myself.
Lip-Synca is the drag persona of John Epperson. Since the early 1980s, Epperson has performed show-length lip-sync routines to brilliantly edited and complex montages of audio clips featuring some of Hollywood's greatest actresses and singers. Epperson's work has been called by the New York Times a free-ranging commentary on perceptions of feminine identity, stardom, and sexuality. We recently spoke over Zoom about his work and his thoughts on Joan Crawford and Mommie Dearest. As part of your act throughout the years, you have revisited a lot of the work of Joan Crawford through your show, The Passion of the Crawford, and then also you had Lip-Synca is Harriet Craig. So I was wondering if you would just tell me a little bit about your history with Joan Crawford and how you came to incorporate her into your act so frequently.
My first awareness of Joan Crawford was listening to my parents and my mother's mother in Mississippi talking about Mildred Pierce. Every once in a while, it would come up. And the real point of those discussions was, did Joan Crawford and Anne Blythe really slap one another when they were filming, or did they fake it? Part of my fascination with Joan Crawford was just her face. I think it's a very graphic face. If you wanted to talk in terms of design, if faces are designed, and hers pretty much was. She chose to have her lips that size. She chose to have her eyebrows that size. She had no control over the size of her eyes, but she didn't shy away from the fact that they were enormous. So I was very drawn to her face. That was what interested me at first. And then I started to see there was so much more going on than just that.
What parts of her, when you're thinking about putting your shows together, do you like to emphasize when you're thinking about her persona and how you portray it?
Well, in all of my shows, I'm interested in, and this is not the only thing I'm interested in, but I've been interested in juxtaposition. A person will say one thing, and then the next person will say the flip of that. And she pretty much contradicted herself quite a bit, you know. And so I was trying to capture that. But I also, in my show, The Passion of the Crawford, I wasn't really trying to do an impersonation of Joan Crawford because I don't think I really look like Joan Crawford. I was more interested in, well, I call the show a fantasia on the personality of Joan Crawford, but it was more like a fantasia on anyone who has created themselves and made this thing, an image, as she said. You know, she talked about image.
So I'd love to read you a quote from something that has been written about you. It says, "Even today, a performer as gifted as Lip-Synca, whose acts consist entirely of an intricate series of quotations from films, succeeds as a brilliant comic by virtue of her uncanny ability to play upon the audience's gleeful sense of unity as a minority. Lip-Synca simply mouths the words, 'No wire hangers' or 'Barbara, please,' and her audience disintegrates into laughter caused not only by the intrinsic hilariousness of the lines, but also by the delight we take in the unanimity of our response." I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see Mommie Dearest sort of living on in the future, because it seems like understanding it and learning the vocabulary of it is almost like a rite of passage to become a part of this inside joke that these communities have with each other.
Well, first of all, one thing the writer of that got wrong was that I never bothered with the wire hanger stuff because that just seemed too cheap and too easy. And I let other people focus on the wire hanger aspect. But Barbara, please, yes, I latched onto it. And also, when I started doing these shows, I didn't know that events like my show or anyone else's show were really about community. I see that now. But at the time when I started my so-called career, I just wanted to be noticed. I think it's funny no matter what. But if you know it's from the movie Mommie Dearest, it does add an extra layer for you as an audience member. There was a time, I think, when the movie Valley of the Dolls was the rite of passage. And maybe it still is to a degree. But Mommie Dearest may have superseded Valley of the Dolls. Why? Well, we all have a mother. We've all been a child. We all have not necessarily been drug addict Broadway stars, unfortunately, but we've all had a mother and we've all been a child, and so there's something primal about Mommie Dearest that anyone can relate to.
She is a key figure in gay communities. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that as to why Joan and why not other figures like, Carole Lombard or Myrna Loy. Is there something specific about Joan that you think stands out?
If you want to hear my crackpot theory about why gay men like female stars in general, it's not so much Myrna Loy or Carole Lombard, as you said, but, gay men are crazy about not just Joan Crawford, but Bette Davis and Liza Minnelli and Judy Garland and Marilyn Monroe and on and on. My crackpot theory is, in part, gay men are the other, right? They're the other. And women are the other in a patriarchy. And so there's that identification. And if the woman happens to be really talented or really beautiful or really sexy or really vulnerable, then that makes her even more the other. And so they relate to that. Look at Natalie Wood, for instance, who's all of those things. Beautiful, sexy, vulnerable, talented. And Joan Crawford was a very handsome woman and had some kind of talent. It wasn't the depth that an Uta Hagen or a Bette Davis or a Meryl Streep had, but she definitely had something. And so gay people are drawn to that because gay people are outside the norm, just like a beautiful, talented woman is outside the norm. But then along comes 1962, and Crawford's gay contemporaries enjoy the gargoyle version of Joan Crawford too. And whatever happened to Baby Jane? Is that a post-World War II cynicism? Is it gay people's own frustration that they're getting older and they see that reflected in Joan Crawford and Bette Davis? It gets very complex at that point.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's always this tension between sort of a gleeful parody and also just feeling genuine love for these figures.
Yes, I think that's true. And maybe some people see my act as that. But I like Joan Crawford. She's as tragic a figure, I think, as Judy Garland and Marilyn Monroe and Elvis Presley, except she was not a public drug addict like they were. Her problems were more private. I thought Feud nailed that in the last episode in a way that the movie Mommie Dearest did not quite get. A man named Carl Jonas, who worked at Columbia Pictures in the 70s, he wrote a book, because he got friendly with her. He wrote a book about it. It's called Crawford, The Last Years, or The Final Years, something like that. In that book, she says, I realized recently that I don't really know exactly who I am, that I've been playing all these roles, and they're part of who I thought I was. But now I realize I don't know who I am. That's very touching to me.
Right. It's sort of like this idea that you can do everything correct and do everything that they tell you and buy into the system, and it's still going to destroy you, basically.
Yes. And I can see why she did it. It must have been very thrilling and glamorous and exciting to be at MGM. She was a practically starving chorus girl, and now she's being built up at a big corporation movie studio. In 2000, I was doing a show in New York called Lip Sync of the Box Set. Mike Nichols came to see it. He was telling people to go to it. And so one night, who shows up but Mrs. Robinson with her husband, Mel Brooks. And they came to the dressing room afterwards, and my makeup guy and I, we love Joan Crawford, and we love Faye Dunaway, and we love Mommie Dearest, and so we had on the dressing room mirror a little postcard I have of Dunaway in costume for Mommie Dearest, and I pointed to it, and I said to Anne Bancroft, "Is it true that you almost played this part?" And she said, "Dodged the bullet on that one."